Hello, and welcome to episode 153 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. We are here today with Matt Robbins, president of the American Majority, former political director for the California Republican Party. Matt is also the former regional coalitions director for the Mid-Atlantic region on McCain-Palin presidential ticket in 2008. And he is also a former campaign staffer for the Bush-Cheney re-election campaign. Matt, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
Happy to be here, Jordan. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. The first question I'd like to pose to you is, what are you currently doing, or what have you ever done to advance the public interest, and why?
Well, I like to think that my entire service, both political and nonprofit and in an advocacy or even indirect lobbying, I think it's all of a common thread, and I hope that I give my time back in volunteer causes, as I think you do, with Close Up Foundation, which brings high school kids from all over the country, all 50 states, and some additional territories, and maybe even foreign countries these days. And we like to teach civics in a very informal but presentable way in the debates there that we do for Close Up Foundation. I also work closely. I'm on the board of trustees of the American Council of Young Political Leaders, which I'm very proud of. I spend a lot of time on that bipartisan organization, making sure that we send 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans every 6 weeks or 8 weeks or so to an outbound delegation to perform public diplomacy and meet their peers in the political process in other countries. So I think I've got a long record, about 15 years plus now, of not only campaigns and not only trying to move the partisan football, but also to achieve goodwill and some real sort of earned opportunities along the way.
Now, at American Majority, it seems as though the average age that an individual associated with your organization got involved in politics was about the age of 13. Can you speak a little bit about how you originally became involved in electoral politics, or civic engagement in some other manner, and how you actually came to identify as a conservative within the Republican Party?
Sure. No, that's a great question. I have been political my entire life, and I didn't act on it, didn't do anything professionally until well after graduation from college. I was one of these people who certainly had strong beliefs, certainly followed it. In my case, I don't really follow sports, Jordan. I follow politics, and that's my competitive outlet. But I realized, and after a few years of school teaching, actually, in another lifetime, about 15, 20 years ago now, I realized that I was passionate about this field of politics. I realized that my students were asking me questions about the civic process, and I didn't have good answers about how it actually worked. And so I moved to D.C. Around the year 2000, and have been ardently involved ever since. Getting involved is very easy, as you know. Getting involved in a county committee, in the formal apparatus of a state party, in the formal apparatus of a national party, finding a candidate, finding a primary challenger, finding a presidential perhaps on which you can volunteer or serve, or just simply distribute signs and literature and bumper stickers. And so that's been a thread throughout my earliest days. But my first job here in D.C. was actually at the Defense Department, in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And so that was a job that was very bureaucratically minded, very important for the warfighter, of course, but didn't have the juice that I wanted as far as the contest, as far as the political contest. I thought the stakes were incredibly high. Coming from a military family, I thought the stakes were incredibly high in 2004. And so I was offered a chance to get on the Bush-Cheney re-election effort and jumped at that, of course. Was thrilled to see the surge in Iraq some years later, and whatever the outcome of that situation, whatever the decisions that went into that, I was happy to see the attempt being made to actually help our guys and gals who were over there perform the mission, actually, and try to accomplish it, even though it never did materialize. So, long story short, I've been involved from afar. I've been involved up close and personal. I've hired and fired staff now for about 10, 12 years. Run training efforts at nonprofits, trained about 45,000 folks. And it's a wonderful thing. If you don't like people, if you don't enjoy your fellow human being, then you have no business being in politics, because you're going to be immersed in them all the time.
So originally you made a career working on campaigns, at least
that's right,
2 back-to-back presidential campaigns. Now, making a career out of campaigns can be somewhat tumultuous. There's less stability because you have no idea if you're going to win, and obviously there's a term limit on on your job, right? Because on election day, especially if you lose, but even if you win, the campaign isn't really what it was the day before election day. So how did you go about making a career originally out of working on campaigns, and then how did you transition away from that?
Well, I've been very fortunate, and my spouse was very supportive of my first foray into state politics, and I was still working days, during the daytime hours at the Pentagon, and I would race down 95 and work on a race in Northern Virginia, and I would spend my nights and weekends, and that's what it takes, as you know, door knocking, meeting voters, persuasion, dropping literature, all those things, all the events and all the different mobilization and organization of activists takes all that free time that everybody gives you. Everybody has jobs and lives and families, and so they're giving you their sweat equity whenever they can afford to do so. And so I had the luxury of being able to do those two things at once, and did that for about a year. We were skilled enough and really sort of lucky enough to win that primary after working so hard. And then we won the general, and we sent somebody to Richmond. We sent my first candidate to Richmond to be a state delegate. And then, after that, the Bush-Cheney offer came, and I resigned from my day job at the Pentagon because I was offered a full-time position with the presidential campaign, and that took the better part of 2004. It took about 10 months. Of course, when that was over, you either go into the administration in the second term or you go on to other things. And so I did. I went on and did some consulting. I did some grassroots advocacy and lobbying for associations and for some veterans groups and other types of sort of clients that are on the center right. And I enjoyed that. It was an immersive experience doing speakers bureaus and really interacting with a lot of the same people that I had just mobilized previously. And then I was brought on to another nonprofit, the Leadership Institute, to direct all their training. This niche field of political training is really my sweet spot, Jordan. It's really a narrow niche. It's somebody who's a former teacher like myself, somebody who enjoys telling others what he's learned along the way, and sort of hoping they can avoid the hard knocks and mistakes. I really enjoy being able to impart even the limited lessons that I've learned from my multiple campaigns.
Tell me a little bit more about American Majority. It's a training organization, and it's nonpartisan, but it does focus on primarily Republican candidates, I believe. Can you speak a little bit more about the mission and then the tactics, how you actually execute in getting people to run for office, and then what your track record has been?
Well, I'm very proud of the track record. Again, we trained over 40,000 folks inside of about 8 or 9 years. The organization is only about a decade old at this point. Formed before the Obama years, formed actually in the last year of the Bush administration, because many in the base, center-right conservative grassroots base, were not happy with the direction of the final years of the Bush administration. So there is a restive part of the party that's always been, budget hawks and not so concerned with foreign policy, not so concerned with social policy, but very, very laser-like focused on economy and things like the bailout and things like, the final programs for Wall Street were really upsetting to a lot of those folks. Training is a wonderful thing. We were able to recruit and identify candidates. About 1 in 10 people becomes a candidate. You can understand the sacrifices involved with that since you've done it personally. And so you train 40,000 folks. You get about, under 3,000, under 4,000 folks who actually step forward and decide to run. Now, they're not all Republicans. I'm very proud, and I mean this sincerely. I'm very proud of our nonpartisan status at the American Majority, and even Leadership Institute prior to that, because we never coordinated, not once, with Republican state parties. We never sent an email to a distribution list of a county committee. We never sent one to a women's club or a college Republican club or any of that. We sent the information out on social media and let whoever wanted to show up. So they self-selected and identified themselves. I've trained, certainly Republicans in the mix, but I've trained self-identified disaffected conservatives, declined the states, Democrats, independents, lots of libertarians. I mean, a lot. I've even trained Green Party members in Hollywood, California. So we really cast a wide tent. And again, the focus was on good stewardship and fiscal sobriety. And that really, really turns out a different breed of people.
Interesting. How did those issues become so important to you? We spoke about how you've been involved in politics and how it has replaced the competitive entertainment aspect that sports plays in many people's lives. We spoke about how politics has been exciting and interesting, but let's return a little bit to your political identity. Why is fiscal responsibility and good governance something that's so attractive to you as an element of your political ideology?
I think, looking at my heritage, looking at my genealogy, literally my grandparents and great-grandparents who were FDR Democrats and who really, saw a government program and a government overarching umbrella of protections help them achieve the American dream. And then watching my father be the first to go to college and watching him volunteer and join the Marines and volunteer for combat in Vietnam and become a pilot. There's a real sense of responsibility and a real sense of paying it back. And so when you see that sort of American dream start dissolving, or at least fraying heavily around the edges, in my youth in the 70s and 80s, and you see the multinational corporations and the importation of automobiles and everything else as the global village starts in earnest, and you see cable TV that's worldwide, you really sort of, it's not nostalgia, but you sort of wonder where things go wrong. You sort of don't understand why things can't be a little simpler, a little more, no thumb on scale, but a little better for the average person. So I'm very much an activist and a supporter of the little guy. And I think both parties have had that strain inside them. I know Republicans have had this image of being the monopoly, player with the monocle and the top hat. And I know that's been a mantra for the Democrats, but there really is a great swath of Americans, whether it's Main Street or Appalachia or minorities or inner cities or whomever you go to, that it really feels left out by this entire process. And so for me to be able to educate and impart to these folks that they can really affect the levers of power, the dirty little secret, of course, is mobilizing and organizing and finding folks to come out for you and try to win that primary election and try to affect change. It's really inspiring to me. I'll be frank with you. I'm not necessarily obsessed with economics. I don't really follow it that closely, but I think the economic lessons stem from strong leadership and come and grow naturally from somebody who understands the duty to the American voter, the duty to the American worker, the duty to families and the folks who are struggling and folks who are trying to make it and who play by the rules all the time and who want nothing more than a level playing field or to be left alone as they go about their version of the American dream. And so I very much take heart in being able to travel and train and meet with these people and explain to them there's not some mysterious barrier to entry to politics. It may be hard to actually overcome the odds and accomplish your goals and win office, but by God, everybody has a right in this country to go out and try, and you can really accomplish a lot by assembling a movement, as you know well. Whether it ends electoral office or not, you can mobilize a lot of people and keep them engaged in the process, which has to have an effect where they live and breathe in their local communities.
Do you find it's ever difficult to separate your perspective and your political identity and values from that of individuals who are seeking your training? Would you ever deny training to someone with whom you might grossly disagree? For instance, someone who is libertarian may think, well, I don't feel like I have a responsibility to somebody in the other part of the country, and maybe local government is what's most important to me. Or a Democrat who says, I have an overwhelming responsibility to everyone in the country, and we need more taxes to provide for more programs to help the little guy, pull the little guy up. I mean, those perspectives may not completely jive with your values. Right. How are you able to train individuals such as those to be individuals who may agree more with you, but yet you're training them since they're clients seeking your training? How do you balance that?
Well, it's tricky. By law, 501c3, which both those organizations I mentioned I worked with are unable to deny admission to anybody. Having said that, should a Richard Spencer or someone of that ilk ever have shown up, which that never happened in my experience, 50, 60, 70,000 people all told between those two groups now in those years, I would have barred them. I mean, there's no room for hate speech. There's no room for Nazism. There's no room for white supremacy. There's no room for any sort of separatist, racist, really insane movement in today's modern politics. Do I disagree with some of the folks I trained? You bet. I trained a wonderful woman, a single mom in Chicago, whose sole goal, she was as big a government program believer as anybody I've ever met, but her entire goal, as she's raising multiple children in Chicago, was to knock off a corrupt alderman who'd been there for generations and decades. And I'm all for that. I'm all for change. And I think training these folks and sending them into the fray, I'm a big believer in the marketplace of ideas. I'm a big believer in the competitive nature of this country. I think Americans shop and consume constantly. They're comparison shopping constantly. They do it in their politics. It's instinctive to us. It's natural. So if your ideas can survive, then more power to you.
So, Matt, a lot of the nation has become quite partisan. And in fact, many of the districts have been gerrymandered, or people have self-selected in where they've lived, or they're so influenced by their neighbors, or for whatever other reasons people select their political identities, you find that it seems as though most of the nation is heavily of one political persuasion or another. And so you find that increasingly general elections are more of a walkover than a competitive election between ideas, and that the real competitive elections are in the Democratic and Republican primaries, and that the victors of those partisan primaries become the inevitable victors in the general election.
Absolutely.
So you're talking about a competitive exchange of ideas, but in reality, the majority of the American electorate has to choose between people who ideologically are very difficult to differentiate between. How are you able to prepare candidates to function and succeed in that environment?
Well, and that's this is a thesis-worthy question, Jordan. It's an amazing fact of our political life in that we've always had a binary system. It's always been a two-party system. The barriers to entry for a third party or more than three parties are prohibitive, and that's the way the status quo likes it. That's the way the incumbency prefers it. I don't believe in conspiracies, but that is the way the natural, centers of gravity and power have gone in this country. And so my real ethos and my real mission statement and that of those organizations I've worked with has been to explain to people this is the pragmatic, realistic way of the world. This is the political system in America, like it or not. You can rally all you want for a third party or a third way, as Tony Blair would say, overseas. But the reality is you're going to have to work from inside. Now, the reform possibilities from within a party, as you know, on both sides of the aisle are immense, whether you're Howard Dean a decade ago, whether you're Bernie Sanders today, whether you're Ted Cruz or Rick Santorum. There are candidates of change. There are candidates who want to swing the pendulum. President Trump has done that, and he's come in and basically executed a hostile takeover of the Republican Party. He's swiveled and pivoted the party onto very populist issues that were anathema a few years ago, questioning 9/11 responsibility, at least culpability for President Bush, talking about trade and talking to unions and talking about infrastructure. These were issues Republicans didn't want to discuss at all just a few short years ago. So that's the top of the ticket, but there are so many opportunities for a strong leader at the local and community levels. And if you're a state rep or a state senator or an alderman or a mayor, you can, through the strength of your personality and through the power of good, sound, sober ideas, you can affect a hell of a lot of change in your local party or state party platforms.
So speaking about state and local political platforms, obviously, there are about 500,000 Americans currently who are in elected office or have run for elected office who are alive today. And most of them have not run for federal office. A lot of times when individuals speak about the government, they refer to the federal government, an elected office, primarily in Congress. But would you take a moment and talk about why it's important to focus on state and local politics and how that may also affect citizens' lives?
Yeah, it's remarkable. In my travels, and as I've encountered, again, tens of thousands of people, there is this idea that this faraway capital, this Washington, D.C., it's like the Hunger Games or something. They think there's this faraway, sinister capital. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of fraud, waste, and abuse, and a lot of just graft and corruption that goes on in Washington, D.C. They call it a swamp for a reason. But in my experience and in my actual study, I'm not a scholar. I'm not a fellow at some think tank. I'm a practical, realistic political operative. Watching the decisions made at the county board of supervisor level, watching the decisions made at the county commission level, watching the half penny taxes that are added or not added, the plastic bag decisions that are added or not added, the sanctuary city status, all these decisions are made at local levels. Trans bathrooms, social issues, economic issues, they're made oftentimes at local levels, and that's how it should be. Federalism is enshrined in our Constitution, and so I'm very laissez-faire when it comes to that. If you want to vote with your feet, if you want to move to where you want to be a more center-left or center-right or even right down the middle, moderate area, that's your business. But don't be fooled and think that all the decisions that affect your daily life are being made by somebody pushing a voting button in the chambers of Congress thousands of miles away. It's probably the person you're inviting to your Rotary Club. It's probably the person you're inviting to breakfasts in your hometown. It's probably the folks you see at church who are actually making those decisions because they're having to deal with the budgets, they're having to deal with the payrolls, they're having to deal with the fact that properties and facilities are aging and needing to be repaired, and all these things that affect school systems and prisons and courthouses and all these things right under our noses where we live and breathe.
So, Matt, I know you just made an offhanded joke about D.C. being a swamp, but in all seriousness, around the nation, there's a perception, especially in this last presidential election, that politicians are corrupt or only in it for themselves or are not pursuing the most noble and honorable path possible of civic engagement and public service through elected office. Yet your position at American Majority is designed to basically sell elected office as something that's noble and honorable. So can you take a moment and speak about why people may not think that Washington is such a good place and that Congress is full of individuals who are trying their best to serve their country? Why is that, and why would people have the perception that Washington is a swamp, especially in light of the idea that you're trying to encourage more people to run for office? Clearly, you must think that there's something noble and positive about politicians.
I do. I'm a big believer in the Athenian model of democracy. I'm a big believer in the republic that we have. I'm a big believer in folks representing their own interest, and we're all special interest in a sense in that regard. Look, Congress is conceived of by the average voter, the average American, the average small-town citizen, big-town citizen, as this nebulous, amorphous group, and everybody hates it. Its ratings are lower than anything else in America, even the media. And yet when you get to the point where they talk about their individual representative, their individual congressman, they have a warm idea. They have a warm relationship because that person, or male or female, comes back to the district and talks to them, meets with them, sends franked mail, answers constituent questions, does casework for them as far as Social Security or social programs. And yet, Congress, you're one of hundreds, literally 535 people who are making these decisions. I would argue there's much more nobility in going to your state capital or even lower, going to where you live, where your children go to school, where you shop, where you spend your money, where you worship, where you reside. I think that's where the real power is. If you make it to Congress, that's great, but your power is going to be subsumed by a larger body. And yet, unless you're a very charismatic, strong leader, it's going to take you decades to rise to the top in chairmanships and influential things. And even then, those things are only going to be seen behind the scenes. So I think if you want to have more bang for your buck, our focus really, really was state and local, like the back of the shampoo bottle, rinse, repeat. We wanted people to get into the state house, throw incumbents out, breathe new life into it, inject fresh blood into the system, put some new reform ideas that haven't been perhaps talked about because of corporate concerns or because of whatever control of whatever state house in whatever state you're talking about. We think a healthy, sense of revolution, a sense of constant turnover and churn is a very viable thing in America. We think it's a very wonderful thing. We hate the fact that there's 98.5% of Congress that's reelected every single 2 years. Even in the Tea Party, the so-called Tea Party year of 2010, that percentage went down to 85%, which is not a good batting average, not a good encouraging sign for all the sea turtles, in a sense, that we're sending, to the water from the sand. So I really think, part of me, I'll finish the question with this answer. Part of me just admires anybody who's willing to take on the challenge, the sacrifice, the time, the personal blood, sweat and tears, the family, giving their entire life to this aim for a year or more in many cases. That's very noble. I think that's very, very Norman Rockwell, very American. And yet, not all of them make it. Many of them don't. Most of them don't. I think it's an inherently unique thing for someone to think, hopefully for the right reasons, of serving their fellow citizens.
So as we approach the end of this podcast, I'd like to ask you a final question. You mentioned how the American dream is being frayed around the edges, and you mentioned your commitment to civic engagement, your lifetime commitment to civic engagement both in the classroom, on the campaign trail, and elsewhere throughout the nation. I'd like to ask you to reflect upon your career in public service and take a moment and speak about how being civically engaged has begun to repair the American dream, why you've been able to why it's been so important for you to dedicate so much of your time and effort and resources to being civically engaged and promoting civic engagement among others, and then what do you hope your legacy will be? What will the American dream look like after you've served your career to promote civic engagement?
Well, that's another great loaded question. I really do. I'm not a public servant. I haven't, truly, served in an elected capacity or helped, make the decisions that I just mentioned that actually move people's lives forward. But I do like to think that I've sent, wave after wave and crop after crop, and even individual after individual to elected office, and at least, go to the ramparts and attempt to challenge the status quo. I'm very proud of my ability to and my gifts that I've been given to help energize and mobilize and inspire others, because it's so much of this job, so much of the tasks that I've been fortunate enough to be involved with are simply listening. I won't call it hand holding, but it's motivational. It's empathy. It's understanding folks where they come from and explaining to them there's not some mystique, there's not some bizarre alternate universe they can't be a part of, that this really is not rocket science. And I really do feel a strong swelling of personal pride in the fact that I've pulled sort of the blinds off so many things and explained to folks how this thing actually works. I think it's a remarkable thing to get people involved in anything in this day and age when our attention spans are being fought for 2-second increments online and on television and everywhere else in between. I think to have people who give up a Saturday, give up a weeknight or a series of weeknights, much less multiple meetings, continue to meet with you, want resources from you, want curriculum from you, want pointers from you, want what amounts to practically political consulting advice from you, and all this for free, by the way. All this given to them is subsidized by donors and by foundations who want to see civic engagement. I think it's a very great thing. You don't see this in Europe. You don't see this where I've been and traveled and trained in the Balkans. You don't see this in South America. You see a very state-run, top-down, command and control idea. And so I think this bubbling up from below, this grassroots percolation, if you will, is a really remarkable, really beautiful thing. Warts and all, ugly candidates, beautiful candidates, accomplished people who have no business running. It's really, it's like church. The doors swing open and everyone's welcome. It's really a remarkable, joyous part of American life, and I'm proud to have been a part of it.
That has been Matt Robbins, president of American Majority, the former political director of California's Republican Party, the former Republican coalitions director for the McCain-Palin presidential campaign in 2008, and former campaign staff for the Bush-Cheney reelection campaign, who speaks about grassroots percolation, about empowering individuals on the most local level to take control of their own tax dollars, acknowledge their responsibility to their fellow man, to society, to perpetuate a tradition of good governance and stand up and run for office. Matt speaks about his willingness to embrace new ideas, his family's roots back in FDR's New Deal, Democratic platform, and then his transition to his support of a more Republican platform, and encourages individuals of all political persuasions to run for office. He speaks about an American dream being frayed, and that the best way to repair that fabric of American democracy is to promote civic engagement, especially at the state and local level, where the state and local governments have a great impact that can be felt quite immediately by citizens in those communities. So in a sense, Matt's efforts to advance the public interest have been by attempting to advance good governance, to field a better crop of candidates that lead to a more competitive election, that provide Americans greater choice on the ballot, and of course choice and better choice with a variety of candidates who are well prepared to assume office would be somewhat equated with an improved state of the health of American democracy. And that, for Matt, is what has made it all worthwhile. So, Matt, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And that has been episode 153 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. I'll remind you to subscribe at publicinterestpodcast.com, listen on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Blueberry, Player FM, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And should you wish to speak to Matt, you can call 240-630-0380, and that voicemail will be conveyed to him. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you next time.